how many organizations do you speak to, would you say, where they really truly understand their data? They actually have a concept of what their data means to their organizations. Would you say it's quite widespread in your experience?
I would say it's actually probably a low percentage. So they're all trying to get a handle on that, right? So that's why they're trying to do it. So there's such a growth in data these days that they have an idea of where it is, but they still don't know what it is and who's doing what with it. So from a percentage standpoint, I think from an overall security standpoint, they're all secured, right? But as you start to move down the layers into the data and what it is and what it entails, that's where I'll say the percentage of people who know what that is and what it's doing, it starts to go down. And so that's the growth. That's the awareness that people are seeing. It's like, hey, we need to get a better handle on our content. And once we know what that content is, now we can determine how best to secure it between both of these, access and retention.
So I often characterize data security is almost like an invisible threat. It's not like your traditional threats that are really noisy, that look really scary, that look like they're really urgent, that you're like, wow, I can see all these hacks coming in from all these scary countries doing all the scary stuff. Like, I obviously have to spend lots of money to protect this. Or it could be, well, hang on, we've got this guy in accounts and he's about to leave the organization and he's got access to some of the most sensitive data that could create the most amount of risk. Like, you might not know about that unless you were really engaged at a people level, at a person level, unless you're engaged with HR, unless you understood the business, unless you actually understood where your most sensitive, that risk was. You're not going to protect against that. And also, I think it's also true to say that it's not very sexy or exciting watching Bob in accounts and figuring out if he's going to walk out the door with some sensitive data. But it feels more like, Mr. Robot when you're protecting yourself against some really noisy threat from your firewall. And I think that we need to really kind of change, we need to start thinking about security in terms of like the people as much as the technology to be effective as well. Because ultimately, the only reason you have any of that security is because you're trying to keep the data safe. So it makes no sense to me. It's the wrong way around, Right.
And that's why that proactive piece comes in, Aidan. So you were saying that's the lean towards the zero trust, right? So the proactive piece is not only understanding the data and what it is and providing the access that they only need to, the data they only need to, but then also keeping the data they don't need right now, the business critical data or the old data. They call it redundant, outdated, and trivial information, right? It's not of use to the organization anymore. So you need to proactively remove that or remediate that. I saw a stat, the stat is, I believe, only 10% of your data is relevant to you from a business critical standpoint after 90 days. I mean, think about that, 10%, right? Do you delete 90% of your information after 90 days? No one does, right? Unless you proactively do that. And so, there's a mix between automatically doing it and having the users involved too, but you have to be proactive about that security aspect of it and that governance aspect of it as it relates to not only the content and the data, but the access too.
Yeah, and ultimately, you want to reduce. I don't particularly like this term. You want to reduce your attack surface. You need to find a way of minimizing the data that people can access only to data that they need to access or they should be able to access, or based on their usage as well. So one of the things that we do is we can say, well, why has that user got access to that spreadsheet to all of our customers? And it's not used it in the last year. Like, that's just not needed. Like, that's another opportunity for that user. If that user account were to become compromised, they then would have access to this data, and that can be avoided by just simply removing the access to that data because they don't need it, putting that data somewhere else where it's in a more secure location, and making sure that you can actually prioritize and reduce that risk there. But I think that, again, I think that requires companies to be proactive in their approach towards data governance as well. And I think that, largely speaking, I think that that's quite often not the case. I think it's something that you do after something's gone wrong. Yeah. It's quite often the driver to want to fix these things. People aren't thinking about things in terms of prevention. They're thinking about things of, oh God, something's gone really wrong. How do we fix this? How do we address this? And that's not the right approach.
No, you're right. And that's the hard part, right? Is getting that proactive mindset in, because you're right. There's so many things going on these days, right? not only between what's happening with the work from home and the pandemic and everything. Everything's got all kinds of things going on, but they have to shift their focus to more of a proactive measure of how to secure and govern their data. You're right, and absolutely.
Yeah. I think fundamentally, I think, obviously from your side, with Sherpa, you're very much focused on that governance piece, and obviously our sort of a lot of where we're coming from is that from that security angle. And I think generally security and governance need to become much closer together as well. I think that that's really important if we're going to be successful in keeping our most important assets safe. I see, I've been to too many conferences, and you speak to security people and you start talking to them about like the data, and they're kind of like, yeah, that's the other team. And I'm like, we need to bridge that gap and make that all come together a lot closer, and make that a lot more cohesive. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to have problems.
Yeah, I agree. You're right. And it usually is disjointed, Aidan, you're right. So you have the different teams, and one focusing, again, I think it's more of that perimeter focus too, right? You have a lot of people focusing on that perimeter, then you have a different team focusing on the data and the content, right? And so those have to come together, to make sure you manage it all as one, as a cohesive strategy on how to lock that down and make sure you secure that in the right way.
Absolutely, and I think the same applies for vendors in this space as well. I think that vendors need to find ways of collaborating and actually start talking to each other, because I think that's one of the challenges when we speak to a lot of companies, and they've got, we spoke to one company the other day, and they had 196 different security vendors that they were managing within their organization, and very few of them really integrated or talk to one another. And I'm like, there's just such a missed opportunity there as well. I think that generally, we've got to, security and governance as markets need to get better at integrating their solutions into one another to deliver more value to customers. I don't think that happens enough either. Useless showing an anomaly alert if you don't know if it's regards to your most sensitive data. That tells you nothing. You need I think that if we work closer together, we can give companies a lot more power and a lot more value, rather than just all operating in silo, and then the customer's just trying to manage 150 different dashboards to try and work out what's actually happened. There's a better way of doing this, I'm sure.
Yeah, you're right. And we must have been talking to the same customer, because I just spoke to someone who had 200 systems and they're trying to consolidate down to 5.
Crazy.
It's amazing. And that's the exact reason, is they can't track them all. So from our perspective, it was from an e-discovery perspective, right? So they're going out and they're trying to react to litigation and finding content within their environment, and doing it across 200 systems is so difficult, right? So their path forward is to condense those systems down into about a half dozen that are right for the organization. And so it'll be so much easier to actually secure that data and bring it forward, whether it's for security or governance or e-discovery, whatever it might be. But that's their goal. So you're right. It's just so spread out right now.
Yeah, and I guess that was also one of our objectives as well, is that we saw so many organizations that are like, look, I can find out what people are doing with my data, but I don't know why it's sensitive. I'm like, well, that's good, but you need context. Well, I can find out where my sensitive data is, but I don't know who's got access to it. I'm like, well, surely you need to know that piece. Well, I can find out who's got access to it, but I don't know where and it's like, you need to have all of that together. You need to have that, whether it's between 2 integrated vendors or 1 single vendor, you need to make sure that you have that information in a single point, and also make sure that you're getting the same results from the different vendors that you're working with. Otherwise, it becomes your steps behind the hackers, your steps behind people that want your data, and we're going to need to get quicker. We're going to need to get better at actually finding risk faster, because hackers they're going to continue to prevail.
That's what I was going to say. And the threats, I mean, they continue to get more sophisticated, right? And they have more resource. I mean, you're right. We have to keep up. We have to get ahead, basically. Not even just keep up. We gotta stay ahead. Otherwise, they're going to continue to infiltrate, and it'll just get worse out there. Again, with the sporadic, when I say sporadic, the dispersed environments now with work from home, it's making it even harder and harder. So you're right. We got to keep up, and we got to stay ahead of that.